I want to kick off with the operating conditions. Just give me a sense of what the quarter felt like to you. How is the Saudi economy helping you push forward?
Morning. The Saudi economy doesn't directly affect us as we're obviously very export-oriented. So Q2, overall, domestically in terms of the production side was very stable. I'm very happy with what we're doing in terms of the operations. The challenge obviously is coming on the pricing side. So far, pricing was pretty stable in Q2 versus Q1. Gold was a little bit off. But certainly aluminium and phosphate held up pretty well in Q2. Obviously a lot of uncertainty around the tariffs and the trade issues, but so far that's not actually feeding into realized prices, at least in Q2 and so far in Q3.
Darren, very good morning to you. It's Menace. As you say, your focus is to the rest of the world, not necessarily the domestic economy. At the start of the year, everybody talked about synchronized growth. Now they're talking about clouds. How grey is your sky?
Well, it's difficult. The sun keeps peeking out between the clouds, Manas. So, you see that in the volatility in prices. So if you look across our commodities, phosphate overall is looking reasonably positive. It's been on an upward trajectory since last year. We think maybe later in the year could be a little bit weaker as more supply comes into the market. Gold seems to have softened quite a bit in the last 6 months or so. We'll see whether uncertainty helps on that. I think the hardest one to call is aluminium. Generally, the market's certainly not pricing in any further problems with Rusal. And the underlying situation in China in aluminium looks net positive. But we don't see a lot of movement. But the problem with the trade situation is that, of course, it's very difficult to predict the next move. So although the market looks reasonably benign for aluminium, any big trade actions or tariffs could have an impact on pricing.
Darren, in previous comments, you underscored your appetite for making some acquisitions abroad. Could you give us some color? Where are you looking? How much do you have in your war chest? Just to give us a sense of, what kind of appetite you have.
Yeah, it's really driven by complementing our existing business. There's two areas. Phosphate, we're already global. We're close to becoming the third largest producer of phosphate globally. So by default, we have to think globally. So we're looking at how we position ourselves in the market in terms of making sure we have the right market access, all of the key markets around the world. The other area we would like to grow is base metals. So we have a small copper mine in Saudi Arabia. We'd like to be a lot bigger in copper. We think it's a great metal for the future. So we're looking at how we can perhaps buy into some assets overseas, but also acquire capability that we could deploy in the kingdom to accelerate base metals in the kingdom as well.
Darren, you talk about maybe doing deals out there. I'm looking at Rio. They're trying to do deals. I'm looking at BP. They're doing shale deals. I'm just wondering, to what extent are you seeing a rising tide in asset prices around the world of assets that you might be currently looking at?
I'm not sure they're ever cheap, Manas, to be honest. We've been looking at this market for a while now, and although stock prices have come down, if you look at deals actually done on assets, especially in the base metal space and other attractive areas, they've never been cheap. So actually the prices haven't changed much. I think the outlook for copper in particular remains positive. So unfortunately there weren't really any bargains out there. Everyone's looking for the same thing. So we have to be very selective in what we pursue.
Darren, the majority of your debt is floating, and that means you're exposed to higher SIBOR and LIBOR rates. What extent is that weighing heavily on your shoulders as you look to the rest of the year?
Certainly something we've been thinking about, Yusuf. So we've started hedging in this quarter. Some of our fixed rate debt, the yield curve at the moment is looking pretty flat, so it's a good time to be locking in some rates. So we'll continue to do that for the balance of the year. Having said that, we don't mind having some exposure to floating, but as you say, there's more floating exposure than we'd like at the moment.
Darren, just very briefly, you're talking about hedging your interest rate exposure there. I'm just wondering, to what extent are you using futures or over-the-counter markets in terms of hedging any of your fundamental commodity exposure?
We don't, Manus. I mean, our view is our shareholders want exposure to the commodities that we're in, and particularly as they're not correlated, our commodities. I think it would change the nature of the company's profile if we were to start hedging some of those commodities.
We understand, Darren, that you're working with some financial advisors to restructure your balance sheet. Could you give us some additional details? I mean, what exactly is it that you're looking to change?
Well, what we've been doing, and maybe this is where the reports come from, is refinancing. I mean, the market in Saudi Arabia in particular has been fantastic for financing over the last 12 months, particularly for blue chips. So we've refinanced two of our aluminium companies in the last 9 months. We renewed our revolver in December, and we issued our first sukuk in Q1. So I think that's where the stories are coming from. This is all about basically just repositioning the debt we have. We have a relatively large debt load, but it's a very benign market now, so we've been able to push out some of the tenors. We've reduced the pricing and overall got very flexible terms on our debt. So that's what we're really doing, is repositioning the debt portfolio that we have.